yearn to see Him moving again. And I'm sure that you do as well. Sure, God is always present among us. He's present in nature. He's present in our fellowship. He's present when we share in the Lord's Supper. But quite frankly, I hunger for more. I want to see miracles. I want to see healing in a way that can't be attributed to coincidence or God helping the doctors. I want to see God show up in such a way that the effect can't be written off as some kind of showmanship or manipulation by the worship leader. I want to see people freed from the bondage of hate and the addiction of alcohol and sexual addiction and drug addiction. I long for God to come among us and speak to us so clearly in the church that we will know for sure what His will is for us. Now, the reason I like to see God show up is because He's done these things before. The Bible's full of stories when God moved among His people. It's true that sometimes there were long spans of time, even hundreds of years, that the people had to just trust and obey because he didn't perform any dramatic acts. But the entire Bible teaches us that we can expect God to show up in powerful ways. We know that God showed up in the Old Testament. For example, God showed up to create the heavens and the earth. God showed up with a flood in Noah's time. He showed up in Abraham's time with commands and promises. God appeared to Jacob and Joseph in dreams. He appeared to Moses in a burning bush. God showed up for His people by delivering them from slavery in Egypt, and He also showed up when He parted the Red Sea. I could go on with this. He showed up in the lives of Saul and David and Solomon and all the prophets. He provided deliverance. He performed miracles. He healed people. And He guided His nation. And throughout the entire Old Testament, we see that God showed up time and time and time again. And then we know that God showed up in the New Testament. He showed up in the person of Jesus Christ. And the Gospels give us a picture of the sort of things that happen when God showed up. Water turns to wine. Demons are cast out. People are healed. The blind see and the deaf hear. The lame walk. Bread is multiplied. Repentance is preached. And truth is taught. And people begin to be transformed. Now we might expect those kinds of things from Jesus, because He's God. But what happened? But what about the early church after Jesus ascended back to His Father into heaven? The book of Acts is a record of God showing up time and time again. In the first chapter of Acts, God showed up to raise His Son from the dead. In chapter 2, God showed up at Pentecost. Then in chapter 3, even though Peter and John had no silver or gold, God showed up anyway, and they were able to heal a man who was crippled from birth. And in the next chapter, Caiaphas, the high priest, warned Peter and John to quit preaching, but the apostles prayed to God for boldness, and He shows up. And then in Acts chapter 5, God showed up by striking Ananias and Sapphira dead when they lied to the church. And then fear gripped the church because of that. And as a result, many more people believed. God showed up on the Damascus Road to the Apostle Paul or to Saul. And throughout the remainder of the book of Acts, we see that God shows up to heal people, to cast out evil spirits, to rescue travelers from shipwreck, to heal an apostle from a snake bite, and heal the daughter of a Roman official. And again, the Bible tells us about these things over and over again. And sometimes God shows up after He sought, and God shows up sometime just because of His own sovereign will. But one way or the other, the Bible tells us and teaches us that God always shows up. And this morning I need to tell you something. The church really needs to see God move. but we don't. Or at least we don't see that very often. Why don't we expect him to show up? Well, I think the problem may be partly to our ignorance of God's history with his people, but let me tell you, it's also because of our unbelief. You see, the stories of the Bible now seem distant and unreal to us. And they become like some sort of tall tale or some fantasy movie. You see, we believe God could perform a miracle, at least in theory, but we don't expect him to. The Bible has taught us that God shows up and does such things as this, but life has taught us something else. When a mother dies of cancer, our faith in miracles begin to waver. When we prayed fervently for a son, but he continues to suffer for years with a chronic disease, then we begin to doubt. And we've seen too many church splits over building programs or over singing preferences to believe that God moves among his people anymore. We can't believe that God could perform a miracle of unity among us, so we begin to look for a church that's full of people just like us. We believe God did do mighty things in the past, and we believe that God could do them now, but we don't believe that he does. Not anymore. A few years ago, here in this church, I had a lady come up and ask me if I would anoint her for healing. And I told her I would be happy to do that. And when we announced that we were going to do that, we had several people to come. And they wanted to be anointed for healing as well. But to be totally honest with you, I know I remember standing here and I wondered in my mind, how many people truly expect God to perform a miracle of healing here? I'm afraid we're like the people of Nazareth that I read about in my text. We see no miracles because of our lack of faith. And we expect very little from God, and that is exactly what we get. So we begin to lower our expectations by saying things like, well, God shows up only occasionally, so we need not to expect a miracle. Most of us expect no miracles at all, or very few. We may hope for them, but we don't believe they'll actually happen. When we hear miracle stories, we doubt them and we secretly consider them to be just another coincidence. We've come to believe in a God who showed up many times in the past, but who seldom, if ever, shows up in the present. At least, though, we still cling to the belief that he will show up in the future to resurrect us at the second coming. But we may eventually come to doubt that too. And that's sad, because this is how believers become unbelievers. And we become practical atheists. We keep on coming to church. We continue to serve on the board, and we continue to work in the ministry of the church. But we begin secretly doubting that there's anything supernatural to the whole thing. And that's why we desperately need for God to show up today in some undeniable way. We're so full of doubt today that I'm afraid that nothing will rescue us from it but to figuratively put our hands in the holes where the nails were. We need to see God move in some great, dramatic, unquestionable way in our midst, because our very faith is at risk. I want to tell you something else, though. We change when God shows up. No man or woman can ever have an encounter with God and remain the same. When God's presence shows up, you and I will be permanently changed. And this is why there needs to be a sense of urgency in seeking his presence. Because when we experience it as a church, we will never again be content with church as usual. So what are some of the ways a moving of God shows up in the church? Well, here are three things that happen when God shows up. The first thing I want to tell you is that we will experience healing. You know, or you all know that the Bible is filled with many reports of healing. It's true that not everyone is healed on every occasion, and everyone who was healed or who was raised from the dead died eventually. But the Bible repeatedly promises healing, and it even describes how a church should conduct a healing service. You'll find that in the book of James. So did God go out of the healing business at the end of the first century? Absolutely not. God is still the great physician, and we can still go to Him believing a miracle. The Bible teaches us that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Our doubts about healing limit God's work, but God has in store for us more than we have faith for. Let me tell you today, God still heals. And I have seen it with my own eyes. God still heals. There are churches where God's healing is experienced regularly, and the atmosphere is one of expectation and anticipation. But there are other churches where no one can remember the last time someone was healed, or was even prayed for expectantly. God really heals. He heals today. He heals now. Will we expect Him to? The next thing I want to tell you that happens when God shows up is there will be a moving of the Spirit in worship. Listen, worship doesn't change God, but it changes us. Have you ever attended a worship service where everyone sensed God's moving? I remember probably the most dynamic service I can ever remember that happening was in my home church in Salisbury one time. We were just there for a Sunday night. And there was nothing particularly different that we were going to do that night. But I remember that the pastor gave opportunity for people to share what God was doing in their life. And for some reason, you could just sense the Spirit of God come in that place. And people began to share, and people began to sense the very presence of God. And what a wonderful, exciting peace that settled in over that place. And every one of us, when we left that place, felt that we had actually been in the very presence of God. What an awesome experience that was. And I've never been the same since then because of that. You know, that happened when the Israelites dedicated the tabernacle. After they prayed, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle in such a way that the priests couldn't even go in and perform their duties. Have you ever been in a worship service when the leaders didn't know what to do or say? They didn't have any choruses to sing. They had no words to say because God was talking and they didn't want to interrupt Him. But to tell you the truth, many of us have never seen anything like that. Because our order of service doesn't make room for God. We're so conscious of getting through the program and so we can dismiss at 12 o'clock that there is no time for God. But if you've ever been in a service like that, you know that it changes the church for years when that happens. And when God shows up, leaders should get out of the way. And when God comes to the church, it will be changed for years to come. Do you hunger? I want to ask you, do you hunger for such a moving of God today? Finally, I want to say that when God shows up, we'll see God transforming a life.